It began as a hushed conversation behind Kensington Palace walls one that aides tried to downplay, and courtiers quickly silenced. But the look on Catherine, Princess of Wales's face as she exited that private meeting said everything the palace couldn't. Something was wrong. And it involved Charlotte. What was first dismissed as a rumor soon turned into a royal firestorm, now confirmed by the very people who fought to protect it. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What unfolded behind those closed doors was not a routine discussion, not a simple scheduling adjustment, but something far more unsettling, something that insiders would later describe in whispers, never statements, as a moment when control itself was quietly challenged. Reports suggest that Prince William had been called into the meeting earlier than expected. His schedule abruptly cleared, his tone described as unusually firm. Catherine followed shortly after, composed as always, but those familiar with the rhythm of palace life noticed the difference immediately. The meeting extended longer than planned, stretching into a tense silence that spread across the corridors, where aides waited but were not called in. Various interpretations of that meeting describe a convergence of concerns, some tied to sudden changes in Catherine's upcoming engagements, others to unexplained disruptions in travel approvals that had begun to surface weeks earlier. At first, those disruptions were dismissed as minor logistical errors, the kind that happen behind the scenes in any large institution. But the pattern refused to fade. Engagements were delayed without explanation. Confirmations arrived late or not at all. Routes were altered. And quietly, without announcement, questions began to form. Insiders whisper that palace aides were instructed to remain silent, not just discreet, but deliberately uninformed, as if knowledge itself had become a liability. That level of containment was rare, even within the guarded structure of the monarchy. It suggested something deeper, something deliberate. Catherine's departure from the meeting only reinforced that feeling. Those who saw her described a shift, subtle but undeniable. Composure remained, but beneath it, something heavier lingered. Something unresolved. Later that evening, William was seen in a more private setting, his attention focused not on public duty, but on family. The moment was brief, easily overlooked, yet those closest to the inner workings of the palace noted its timing. It came too soon after the meeting to be coincidence. Media insiders, who had quietly tracked inconsistencies for weeks, began to connect the dots. Something had been off, they said. Not publicly, not visibly, but internally, unmistakably. And as those fragments began to align, one idea emerged with growing clarity. This was never about simple miscommunication or scheduling oversight. It pointed to something more controlled, more intentional. A system that had been quietly shifting beneath the surface, unnoticed until now. And as that realization settled in, the weight of it became impossible to ignore. Because what appeared to be a moment of concern was, in truth, the first visible crack in a structure that had long operated without question. But the chilling truth wasn't just about Charlotte's health, it was tied to a royal legacy that had long been buried. Until now, for years, royal travel seemed effortless, perfectly timed arrivals, seamless tours, flawless appearances. But behind that precision was a hidden authority few dared to question. And when that authority quietly shifted, the consequences were immediate, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. What most people saw was perfection. What very few understood was the machinery behind it, an intricate system of approvals, quiet signatures, and unseen decisions that determined where a royal would stand, when they would arrive, and even how long they would stay. And within that system, reports suggest Queen Camilla had begun to exercise a level of influence that extended far beyond tradition. It wasn't sudden. It didn't arrive with announcements or declarations. It grew quietly, step by step, through what insiders described as domestic coordination, a phrase that sounded harmless, almost administrative, but carried far more weight behind palace walls. At first, the changes were subtle. Adjustments to routes, minor delays, slight reshuffling of engagements that could easily be explained away. But patterns have a way of revealing themselves over time, and those familiar with the internal rhythm of the palace began to notice something that didn't sit right. Catherine, Princess of Wales's schedule, once defined by clarity and consistency, started to shift in ways that felt controlled. Confirmations arrived later than expected. Travel plans were revised without clear reasoning. Engagements that had been firmly set were suddenly placed under review. Insiders whisper that these weren't isolated incidents. They were connected. And more importantly, they seemed to follow a direction. A quiet hand-guiding movement, not through visible authority, but through procedural control. It wasn't about denying access outright, it was about slowing it, shaping it, redirecting it just enough to create uncertainty. And uncertainty, within the monarchy, is never accidental. It is a signal. Courtiers found themselves divided, though none would say it openly. Some remained aligned with tradition, with the long-standing structures that had governed royal operations for decades. Others, however, adapted quickly to the evolving influence, recognizing where decisions were increasingly being shaped. This silent divide didn't erupt into conflict, but it deepened into something far more complex. A quiet tension, a recalibration of loyalty. And then there was Prince William. Observers say he did not react immediately. Instead, he watched. He listened. He allowed the inconsistencies to accumulate, piece by piece, until they formed something undeniable. Because what began as minor disruptions no longer felt minor. They formed a pattern, one that pointed not to error, but to intent. Different interpretations of internal briefings describe William reviewing schedules more closely, asking questions that hadn't been asked before. Why this delay? Why this change? Why now? The answers, when they came, were often vague, layered in administrative language that explained everything and nothing at the same time. But ambiguity, in a system built on precision, is rarely a coincidence. And as these questions lingered, the atmosphere within the palace began to shift. Quietly, subtly, but unmistakably. Because once a pattern is seen, it cannot be unseen. And once intent is suspected, it demands a response. What had once been dismissed as routine adjustments now carried a different weight, entirely one that suggested control was no longer where it had always been. And as William started connecting the dots, one realization changed everything. This wasn't mismanagement. It was intervention. There are moments in royal history when silence becomes impossible, when hesitation gives way to action. For William, that moment arrived not with a public declaration, but with a single, decisive move that would quietly redraw the lines of power inside the palace. What followed was not loud, not immediate, and certainly not visible to the public eye, but insiders suggest it was deliberate, calculated, and deeply unsettling for those who had grown comfortable within the existing structure. Prince William, long known for his measured approach, reportedly began to step beyond observation and into scrutiny. Not the kind that asks polite questions and accepts rehearsed answers, but the kind that dissects patterns, tracks inconsistencies, and refuses to ignore what no longer fits. It started, according to those familiar with internal operations, with something deceptively simple, a review of travel authorizations. At first glance, the records appeared intact. Dates aligned, signatures were present. Approvals seemed legitimate, but as William looked closer, something began to surface: small irregularities, subtle overrides, decisions that didn't follow the expected chain of command. Engagements connected to Catherine, Princess of Wales, showed signs of interference. Confirmations that had been granted were later revised. Routes that had been finalized were quietly altered. And perhaps most telling of all, certain denials carried no clear origin, as if they had been issued from a layer of authority that wasn't officially acknowledged. Those findings didn't stay confined to paper. They demanded answers. And answers within the palace are rarely given freely when the stakes are high. Reports suggest that a private confrontation followed one that took place far from public view, behind doors that have witnessed countless moments of quiet tension throughout royal history. Details remain tightly guarded, as they always are, but different interpretations of that exchange describe a shift in tone. Not emotional, not explosive, but firm, controlled, unyielding. Senior aides, caught in the middle, found themselves navigating an increasingly complex situation. Two lines of authority, both powerful, both legitimate in different ways, now seem to be moving in conflicting directions. And in a system built on clarity and hierarchy, that kind of ambiguity creates more than confusion, it creates instability. Some aides remained silent, choosing caution over alignment. Others adjusted quickly, sensing that a recalibration was already underway. For William, however, hesitation was no longer an option. The more he examined, the clearer it became that this was not a series of isolated anomalies. It was a pattern, a structure, something that had been quietly constructed over time, operating just beneath the surface. And so, according to insiders, he made a choice not to escalate publicly, but to act internally, where the real levers of control exist. Invoking his authority as heir, William is said to have issued a directive, not announced, not broadcast, but circulated where it mattered. A document, brief yet precise, outlining adjustments that would immediately affect how travel decisions were made moving forward. To the outside world, nothing changed. But within the palace, the message was unmistakable. The balance was shifting. It didn't dismantle the existing structure overnight. It didn't erase what had already been set in motion. But it introduced something new: oversight, scrutiny, and most importantly, intent. The first visible signs of a formal shift had begun. Subtle enough to avoid disruption, yet strong enough to be felt by those who understood the system. And as that shift took hold, one reality became increasingly difficult to ignore. Because what William had uncovered was no longer just about altered schedules or delayed approvals. It pointed to something far more complex, something that suggested the system itself had been quietly reshaped over time, without acknowledgement, without resistance, until now. But what William uncovered went far deeper than scheduling. Conflicts had exposed a system that had been quietly reshaped. Power in the monarchy rarely explodes into public view. Instead, it moves in silence through documents, decisions, and doors that close just a little too quickly. And now, behind those doors, a quiet battle was unfolding. What had begun as subtle inconsistencies was now evolving into something far more complex, an internal struggle that refused to stay contained. Reports suggest that within the palace, tension was no longer theoretical. It was present, active, and increasingly difficult to ignore. On one side stood the office of Prince William, operating with a renewed sense of oversight and precision. On the other, the established influence of Queen Camilla's inner circle, still embedded within the operational fabric of the monarchy. Neither side moved openly against the other, but the friction between them began to surface in ways that could not be easily dismissed. It showed first in the details. Directives that once flowed seamlessly now arrived with subtle contradictions. Instructions issued from one office were quietly adjusted by another. Staff members found themselves caught in a growing web of uncertainty following one order risked contradicting another. And in a system where precision is everything, that kind of ambiguity carries weight. It disrupts rhythm. It creates hesitation. It forces choices that were never meant to exist. Insiders whisper that meetings became more frequent, but also more guarded. Not the routine briefings that define daily operations, but closed discussions where tone mattered as much as content. Different interpretations of those meetings suggest an atmosphere that had shifted less collaborative, more cautious. Words were chosen carefully. Positions were implied rather than stated. And beneath it all, a quiet awareness that something fundamental was being contested. At the center of this unfolding tension stood Catherine, Princess of Wales, not as an active participant, but as the focal point around which these decisions revolved. Her schedule, her movements, her presence had become the space where authority was being tested. And though she maintained her composure, those familiar with the inner workings of the palace understood what that meant. She wasn't just navigating public duty anymore, she was positioned within an internal shift she had never sought. Loyalty, too, began to evolve. Not loudly, not publicly, but quietly, through alignment and silence. Some within the institution remained anchored to tradition, to the long-standing structures that had governed royal operations for generations. Others, however, adapted to the emerging reality, recognizing that influence was no longer fixed. It was moving, and in a system built on hierarchy, movement signals change. What made the situation even more fragile was the balance itself. The monarchy has always relied on an unspoken equilibrium, a delicate arrangement where roles are understood, boundaries are respected, and authority flows without resistance. But now, that balance was beginning to strain, not broken, not shattered, but tested in ways that had not been seen in years. And when such a balance begins to shift, the consequences rarely remain contained. Because beneath the silence, beneath the careful words and controlled decisions, one truth was becoming increasingly clear: this was no longer about procedure. It was about control. And control, once challenged, demands resolution. The question was no longer whether something would change, but how far that change would go, and who would ultimately define it. And just when it seemed the conflict might remain hidden, a decisive move shattered the silence completely. Then, it happened. Not with fanfare, not with announcement, but with a single internal order that would ripple through every corridor of royal power. In one move, everything shifted. There was no public statement, no formal acknowledgement, no visible sign that anything had changed. And yet, within the inner framework of the palace, the impact was immediate. Reports suggest that Prince William had reached a point where observation was no longer enough, where patterns demanded action, and where hesitation risked allowing something far more permanent to take hold. The directive, as described by those familiar with its contents, was precise and unmistakable in its intent. It did not accuse. It did not explain. It simply redefined authority. At the center of that redefinition was a single, decisive shift: Queen Camilla's role in overseeing the travel schedule of Catherine, Princess of Wales, was formally revoked. Not publicly, not ceremonially, but structurally. The kind of change that does not seek attention, yet transforms everything beneath the surface. For those who understood the system, the meaning was clear. Control over movement is control over presence. And control over presence, within the monarchy, shapes influence itself. A new structure was introduced almost immediately, one that placed oversight directly within William's office. It was not framed as a takeover, but as a recalibration, a return to clarity, as some insiders described it. Yet beneath that language, the reality carried weight. Decisions that had once flowed through one channel were now redirected through another. Authority, once assumed, now required confirmation. And confirmation, in this context, was no longer a formality, it was a boundary. Senior aides were quietly instructed to follow updated protocols. No dramatic announcements, no sweeping declarations. Just a series of adjustments that, when viewed individually, appeared procedural but when taken together, formed something far more significant. Engagement schedules were reviewed. Approvals were rerouted. Communication lines were tightened. And within days, the effects began to surface. Upcoming royal engagements, particularly those involving Catherine, reflected the shift almost immediately. Timelines stabilized. Confirmations arrived with renewed consistency. The uncertainty that had lingered began to recede, but not without leaving behind a deeper awareness of what had been taking place. Because while the system appeared to regain its rhythm, those within it knew that rhythm had been interrupted for a reason. The reaction, as insiders whisper, was not explosive, but it was unmistakable. Shock did not manifest in open disagreement, but in silence, in recalibration, in the subtle recognition that something fundamental had changed. Queen Camilla's influence, while still present in broader aspects of royal life, was visibly reduced in this specific domain. Not erased, not denied, but limited, defined, contained. And that containment sent a message, not just about authority but about boundaries, about where influence begins and where it ends. Because in a system as structured as the monarchy, even the smallest adjustment can signal a much larger shift. And this was not small. It was quiet, but it was decisive. The balance of internal power did not collapse. It did not fracture. But it moved, subtly, yet unmistakably, toward a new alignment, one shaped not by tradition alone, but by intervention. And intervention, once introduced, has a way of reshaping everything that follows. But while the decision seemed final, its consequences were only just beginning to unfold. Inside the palace, reactions didn't come in statements, they came in silence, in glances, in doors that stayed closed longer than usual. Because everyone understood what this meant. There were no official briefings released to the public, no acknowledgement that anything had shifted. But within the inner circles of the monarchy, reports suggest that the message had already been delivered quietly, deliberately, and with unmistakable clarity. Senior royals were said to have been informed in controlled, private conversations, each one tailored, each one measured. Not a discussion, not a debate, more a recognition of what had already been set in motion. And while no one spoke openly, the understanding was shared. Something fundamental had changed, and it could not be undone. At the center of this delicate moment stood King Charles III, a figure long accustomed to balancing competing forces, now facing a situation that offered no easy resolution. Insiders whisper that he was made aware of the internal shift not as a proposal, but as a reality, one shaped by necessity rather than preference. On one side, the steady rise of Prince William's authority, firm and increasingly decisive. On the other, the established presence of Queen Camilla, whose influence, though not erased, had been unmistakably narrowed in a key domain. The balance he had long maintained was no longer stable, it was shifting beneath him. And yet, outwardly, nothing appeared different. Public engagements continued. Appearances were executed with the same precision, the same composed rhythm that has defined the monarchy for generations. This was not accidental. It was intentional. Efforts were made carefully, strategically to preserve the image of unity, to ensure that whatever was unfolding internally remained contained within the walls of the institution. Because the monarchy, above all else, survives on perception, and perception must remain intact. But beneath that surface, the adjustments were already underway. Staff reshuffles, subtle but telling, began to emerge. Roles were redefined, responsibilities quietly reassigned. Individuals who had once operated within one chain of command found themselves reporting through another. None of it dramatic, none of it announced. Yet each movement carried weight, hinting at a deeper structural recalibration taking place behind the scenes. At the same time, the outside world began to sense that something was different, even if it couldn't yet define what. Media observers noted inconsistencies, minor shifts in scheduling patterns, unexpected changes in engagement confirmations, subtle variations in coordination that didn't align with the usual precision of royal operations. Nothing concrete, nothing provable, but enough to raise questions. And in the world of royal coverage, questions have a way of growing. Public appearances, as a result, were managed with increasing care. Every detail examined, every movement controlled, not out of routine, but out of necessity. Because even the smallest deviation, even the slightest sign of discord, could ignite speculation that would be impossible to contain. And containment, at this stage, had become the priority. The monarchy has faced crises before. It has endured scrutiny, controversy, and internal strain. But what made this moment different was its quiet nature, the absence of open conflict, replaced instead by a controlled, deliberate reshaping of authority. It was not explosive, it was strategic. And strategy, when executed in silence, often carries consequences that unfold slowly, but decisively. Because even as the palace worked to maintain its composure, to present a unified front, the underlying reality remained unchanged. Something had shifted, something that could not be reversed, only managed. And as that realization settled in, one question began to surface, quietly at first, then with growing persistence: why now? And what had forced this moment to arrive when it did? And yet, even as the palace tried to contain it, one question refused to fade: why now? In royal affairs, timing is never accidental. Every decision, every shift, every silence carries meaning. And this moment, this precise moment, felt anything but coincidence. Because if this had been merely about correcting internal inconsistencies, it could have happened quietly at any time. But reports suggest the timing aligned too closely with something else, an intensifying public focus on Catherine, Princess of Wales. Her presence, her role, her growing prominence within the monarchy had already begun to draw attention far beyond routine coverage. Engagements were being watched more closely. Appearances carried greater weight, and with that attention came scrutiny not just from the public, but from within the institution itself. Insiders whisper that this rising visibility created pressure, not only to maintain consistency, but to ensure control over how that visibility was managed. Because in the monarchy, presence is never neutral. It signals authority. It shapes perception. And perception, over time, defines legacy. The disruptions that had once been dismissed as minor now took on a different meaning when viewed through this lens. They were not random. They were occurring at a moment when Catherine's role was becoming more central than ever before. At the same time, Prince William's position was evolving in ways that could no longer be ignored. Different interpretations of internal discussions suggest that his approach had begun to shift from observant and measured to increasingly assertive. Not in public gestures, but in private decisions, the kind that shape structures rather than headlines. And as his influence expanded, so too did the expectations surrounding his role as the future of the monarchy. Expectations that demanded clarity, control, and above all, stability. Questions began to emerge, quietly at first, not spoken openly, but present in the way decisions were interpreted. Who ultimately defines authority within the palace? Where does influence begin, and where does it end? And perhaps most importantly, What does that mean for the long-term balance of power? These were not questions with immediate answers, but they were questions that could no longer be ignored. Some insiders suggest that what unfolded was not a reaction, but part of something broader, a strategic recalibration taking place beneath the surface. A recognition that the monarchy, while rooted in tradition, must continuously adapt to survive. And adaptation, especially in times of pressure, rarely happens without friction. Internal dynamics shift. Roles are redefined. Boundaries are tested. And in those moments, decisions that might otherwise seem procedural take on far greater significance. The pressure itself was not limited to internal factors. External expectations, public perception, media scrutiny, the evolving role of the monarchy in a modern world all contributed to an environment where stability was no longer optional. It was essential. And within that environment, even the smallest imbalance could carry consequences far beyond the palace walls. What made this moment particularly striking was not just the decision itself, but what it signaled. Because signals, in royal affairs, are rarely accidental. They are deliberate, measured, designed to communicate without speaking. And this one suggested something unmistakable, that the next phase of the monarchy was no longer a distant concept. It was already beginning to take shape. Quietly, carefully, but undeniably. Because what began as a quiet adjustment was quickly revealing itself as something far more significant. What seemed like a single decision was never just that. It was a signal, a shift, a message, a glimpse into the future of the monarchy itself. Because decisions like this do not exist in isolation. They echo. They ripple outward, touching structures that have stood unchanged for decades. Reports suggest that what Prince William set into motion was not simply a correction, but the beginning of something far more deliberate, a quiet assertion of operational control within a system that had long relied on inherited balance, rather than active direction. It was not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakably firm. A line drawn without announcement, yet impossible to ignore. At the heart of that shift stood Catherine, Princess of Wales, whose role, once defined largely by expectation, now carried a renewed clarity. Insiders whisper that her autonomy within royal operations had been strengthened, not through public endorsement, but through structural change. The difference was subtle, but powerful. Decisions surrounding her presence, her movements, her engagements were no longer subject to the same uncertainty that had once lingered. Control had been re-centered. And with that came a quiet reinforcement of her position, not just as a figure of continuity, but as a central force within the monarchy's evolving identity. For Queen Camilla, the shift did not erase influence, but it redefined it. The recalibration was precise, almost surgical. Authority that had once extended into certain operational domains was now contained, redirected, and quietly limited. Not a removal, not a rejection, but a narrowing of scope that carried its own message. Because in the monarchy, influence is not only about presence, it is about reach. And when that reach changes, so does the balance it once supported. What made this moment so significant was not just who gained or lost ground, but what it revealed about the institution itself. The monarchy, often perceived as unchanging, had entered a phase of subtle transition. Not a break from tradition, but a reinterpretation of it. The rules had not been rewritten, but they were being applied differently, shaped by the demands of a new era and the realities of a changing world. Insiders suggest that this was not an isolated adjustment, but part of a broader evolution already underway. A recognition that stability could no longer rely solely on legacy, that it required active stewardship. And in that stewardship, roles would inevitably shift. Authority would be redefined. Boundaries would be tested, then redrawn. Not publicly, Not dramatically, but with the kind of precision that ensures the institution endures. Because beneath the surface, the balance of power was no longer what it had been. It had moved. Quietly, but permanently. The structures remained. The appearances held. But the dynamics, the unseen forces that guide decisions and define influence, had begun to align in a new way. One that reflected not just tradition, but intention. And in that alignment, a new internal order began to take shape within the House of Windsor. Not declared, not announced, but present, undeniable to those who understood where to look. A shift not marked by ceremony, but by consequence. And consequences, within the monarchy, are never temporary. They become part of the fabric itself, woven into the future as seamlessly as the past. And as the dust settles, one truth becomes impossible to ignore: the monarchy may look unchanged from the outside. But inside, everything has shifted. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.